Alright, hello. I just want to do a quick video before I head into work. Um, Joe Rogan and Kyle Kulinski recently did a video, a little interview, and I just want to stick to one specific point where he said, sometimes Sweden is used as a, when you bring up Sweden, people say it's, or Scandinavia, they say, well, it's too capitalist, and that's why they're successful. But then you say, well, can we have that kind of capitalism? And conservatives will say, no, they're too socialist, we can't do that. And he tries to point out a inconsistency in conservative / libertarian thought. I want to point out that this is I don't want to say it's necessarily naive, as in he just doesn't understand the argument, and this happens a lot. Leftists are unable to re-articulate arguments that conservatives and libertarians are making. For many different reasons, but number one is just that liberal arguments are everywhere. You hear them, 10 times a day. Conservative arguments are few and far between. So, you just don't have nearly as much exposure. You don't get exposure, people saying the same thing different ways, so that, I might understand something a certain way, and that's how I explain it, and I might have this whole, edifice of thought behind it, but other people might emphasize different parts of that point that I'm making. So that's why it's important to hear the same thing from multiple different vantage points. Anyways, long story short is Scandinavia is not a panacea. Number one, which he just mentioned Scandinavia, and people a lot of times it's really frustrating that socialists will do this. They'll pick one regulation or one thing that they like from a socialist country, and they will say, why can't we have that? It works, that country's run really well, and they don't look at the totality of the system. So for Norway, for example, it's the easiest one to discredit. They produce more oil per capita than Saudi Arabia. Yes, they can have incredibly inefficient policies that are extremely expensive because they have a huge number of resources being imported from the rest of the capitalist world. If they didn't have that huge wealth of oil, they would not be able to afford these policies. Period. That's it. Moving on. Denmark. Denmark's tiny. You can't necessarily draw, policy analysis from a country that's so small. That's smaller than many U.S. cities. Many metropolitan areas in the United States are larger, have more population than Denmark. You can find, different counties, different, cities in America that are doing much better on any metric that you choose. If you look at education, if you look at healthcare, if you look at GDP per capita, if you look at all of these, if you pick any of these things, you can find many different parts of the United States that are doing much better. And the thing about the United States is that it's so big that you have everything. The average will inevitably be brought down just because there's a huge amount of geographical diversity. Look, Denmark is very particularly situated. They don't have to spend a huge amount of money on a military, for example. They have treaties from much bigger partners. They have subsidies. They have certain trade agreements. These are things that cannot be replicated on a large scale. I'm sure if the 100 people Denmark would contribute to a European war, if Europe had to go to war with Turkey, the 100 people, the 1,000 people, it's just not a huge amount of resources that Denmark has to put up for these for these conjoined efforts with the European Union. There are many things that they work together with the European Union on, and Denmark is by far coming out ahead on all of those issues. Anyway, so it's very small. You can't draw much from small countries that are that small. They're smaller than cities. Moving on. Okay, so maybe he means Sweden, which is actually hilarious because, and I don't mean this in a mean way. I just mean that these talking points don't evolve even when, as libertarians predicted, and as conservatives particularly predicted, Sweden has fallen apart in the last 5 years or so. 5 years, Sweden was, the talk of the town, the belle of the ball when it comes to political discussions. Now, people don't mention it. Violent crime has gone through the roof. Rape has gone through the roof. It's been Sweden has had a very difficult couple of years. And not to mention that in 2013, if you wanted to become a trans person, you had to there was forced sterilization in Sweden if you wanted to become a trans person. So it's one of those things. It's an extremely authoritarian country. And right now the authoritarians might be, impose policies that you agree with. However, what happens when they start imposing policies you don't agree with? What about, the trans community in Sweden, circa 2005? The United States has done a lot of bad things, but, not that recently. And, we weren't forced sterilizing trans people in 2013. I'm just going to put it like that. Additionally, all taxes, Sweden is one of the perfect examples. Started out very capitalist in the past and became very socialist very quickly. Again, doesn't have to have a lot of the same, the United States is the military for the entire world. Europe and, South America, all of these countries have a kind of a backstop. It's a put in finance. Essentially, if things go south too much, the United States will step in and, for that reason, almost every country really underinvests in their military because they know that they have essentially an American guarantee that at least their nation states won't be dissolved moving forward. That, as bad as things get, even if we go to World War III, at least, France will continue being France. And that's kind of what American has ensured for the world. If we pulled that assurance, if we said, nope, from now on, Europe's all on its own, we don't care about Europe, you would see, remilitarization, you would see a lot of money being sucked from these social programs, you'd see, the whole world becoming, much less like itself and much more like the United States, because they would have to. Anyways, so long story short, there's a lot of these subsidies that, Sweden gets from the rest of the world, especially the United States, military subsidies, as in they don't have to invest in military because the United States guarantees their freedom. But on top of that, you also have to keep in mind that all taxes are a tax on production, and particularly a tax on children. Now, I can work this out if you want, but, you just have to think about it for even a minute, and you'll see that if I'm the one producing, kids for the, future generations, and, Kyle and his partner are the ones putting money towards their 401k instead of kids, then me and my partner are going to have to invest in both kids and our 401ks and our future consumption. That means we have to consume less now because we're putting money towards, in order to consume as much as Kyle in the future, because we have this huge extra expense called children. Now, here's the thing. You can have all the money in the world in your 401k. If there's only 4 people in the world, we have a closed system. It's me, my partner, Kyle, his partner. If there's no one actually, building roads, if there's no one actually producing food, then it doesn't matter how many dollars you have. There's not going to be any resources to consume. So if me and my partner invest in having 4 children, and let's just say, $200,000 a person, a child, if we are investing $800,000 in future production, which is what children are, they're future taxes and future production, then there's an issue where me and my partner had to invest $800,000 in children, but Kyle is still benefiting from those roads. He's still benefiting from the clean water that they'll produce. He's still benefiting from the farms that they maintain. All kinds of stuff, which just means that, you have this system where Kyle and his partner benefit from me having, from my investments in children. And the problem with this is that when kids do become so expensive and when taxes are so onerous, eventually people have to start decreasing their standard of living in order to have kids, which means that they are, some people will decrease their standard of living a whole lot because they really want kids, and some people will just, maintain their standard of living and have fewer kids. That's what most people do. The problem with this is when it happens nationwide, you get something like Sweden, where there's not enough people to produce resources for the future. The country's too old. And this actually happened in Germany too. During, Obama's years, when you had all of these migrants coming to Germany, they literally had posters saying, hey, these migrants will pay your Social Security. They're saying, hey, these are future taxes, these are future production. Not in so crassly. That's what they're telling their voting population. Same thing with Sweden. They knew that they did not have enough children to maintain the society they built. So what they do, they thought they could import people and, make them Swedish, teach them Swedish customs, and everything would be fine. It's not fine. That's not how it worked. People in, Sweden has gone through a huge spike in crime rates. There's been rapes, there's been murders, there's been all kinds of things that don't necessarily make the news. Grenade attacks, that was a huge thing. Gang violence. Sweden was not ready to deal with gang violence. Simple as that. The United States has had generations of gang violence. We have learned how to deal with gangs. We have learned how to assimilate migrants into American culture. America is extremely good at it. We can assimilate far fewer numbers as a percent of our population of migrants than Sweden can, just because we've had practice. We know what works. And Sweden doesn't. Sweden has no clue what works. They try everything and nothing's working. Same thing with Germany. It's a huge expense to assimilate these migrants, especially because a lot of the expense is in trying things that don't work. Assimilation is a process. There's no reason people would assimilate just because they move somewhere. It is a process that you have to carry out, and the United States is very, very good at it. And the rest of the world needs to take a couple notes. Anyways, long story short, Sweden is not a great example of where we want to be. If the United States were to adopt a lot of Swedish policies, we would run into the same issue. A generation from now, 2 generations from now, we would not have the population necessary to continue our standard of living. GDP would be falling, which what that looks like is it looks like your money is worth less and less and less. Everything would go, would hyperinflate. Just blight across across cities. That's what that actually looks like. On top of that, Sweden is not that different from the United States on the grand scale of things. When you look at, Hong Kong to the Soviet Union, Sweden's not that far from the United States. It's very close in political systems and in economic systems. One of the frustrating things is that what leftists don't understand is that the United States is extremely socialist when it comes to things like regulations, when it comes to things like especially regulations in the medical field, when it comes to regulations in building a house, in finance, all kinds of things. And these regulations act as a tax on individuals and on corporations. And the problem with this is that it's very difficult to quantify a regulation. All people know is that their cars are getting more expensive. They can't put a dollar amount per regulation on that. If your cars are getting more expensive, if your house is, I read one study where 50%, I used to live in LA, and I read one study where it said 50% of the cost of building a new house in LA was due to extra regulations. Just in the time I lived there, they did huge number of regulations on what you could build, where you could build, what you had to include in the building, what had to be on top of the building, how the building was powered, all kinds of stuff, just while I was there. And it's just one of those things. It's like, well, if 50% now of a new home's cost is just in regulations, that's going to price people out of the market. It's too expensive in LA now for most people. Anyways, long story short, if Kyle, there's a lot of agreement between leftists and libertarians and conservatives. There is a huge middle ground where, I think everyone could be happy. And it's not Kyle saying, hey, Sweden has a welfare state, we should have a bigger welfare state too. It's saying, hey, how about we massively reduce the regulations, even just on housing. There's no reason why every house has to be built with a solar panel. There's no reason why, the water in LA is disgusting. Everyone I know uses filters. Everyone I know would drink bottled water because it's clean. Water in LA is disgusting, and yet you have to have these certain pipes and make. Anyways, the regulations on each house are incredible, but it's like, well, how if the water that comes through those pipes is gross, then what does it matter? Come on, LA needs to, as a municipality, needs to decrease the regulations across the board and invest in things like clean water. Anyways, that's neither here nor there, but it's kind of the same thing with United States and Sweden. If we massively took a hatchet to our regulatory code, cut regulations 10 to 1, just focused on, the important things, clean water, clean air, protecting individuals, if we went back to that, we really could slash our regulatory code 10 to 1 and still maintain, a healthy environment, and a healthy populace, then we would have more than enough money to pay for, healthcare, to pay for welfare benefits. But you can't have both. These regulations are taxes, and you can't add more taxes on that and expect something to be okay. A huge portion of what businesses are scared of is just legal liability. All of that needs to be reformed as well. Anyways, I hope you're having a good day, Kyle.